Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for being here with us. My name is Betsy Fischer Martin, and I'm the Executive Director of the Women in Politics Institute here at AU, and we are delighted to have you all with us this afternoon to discuss our new Gender on the Ballot research we're calling Stepping Up and Standing Out, Women's Political Participation in 2020. So with a spotlight on women candidates and women voters in this year's election, we wanted to go beyond the data that exists out on turnout rates, on how women are voting, and look at political participation overall. How are women engaging in the political process and making their voices heard even beyond the voting booth? So who are these women? Are they volunteering for campaigns? Are they contributing to candidates? Are they showing up at marches? And if so, why? And what's motivating them to do that? And if not, why not? What is out there that are holding some women back from becoming more engaged in politics? So Gender on the Ballot is our 2020 partnership with the Barbara Lee Family Foundation, and we are delighted to have my partner in this project, Amanda Hunter, in the middle there with us today. Also on the panel, we have Kate Jeffers, who is our polling partner with Benenson Strategy Group and has done a great job working with us on this poll. And we're also pleased to have Alexi McCammond of Axios here. She covers politics for them, has been traveling a lot, covering the campaign, and wrote a piece based on the research just this morning on Axios. So first, we're going to get an overview from Kate on the findings. We will talk a little bit on the panel about some themes that emerged in the poll, and then we will save plenty of time for the questions. So with that, I'm going to bring up Kate. Thank you.
You guys hear me okay? Excellent. Okay, so as Betsy teed off, this poll is very focused on the voter mindset, what they're doing and how they're feeling about it, kind of looking back at 2016 and then ahead to 2020. So first, just a little, looking just a little bit at the research methodology. This past December, we conducted 800 online interviews among likely 2020 general election voters, and these people were screened on their likelihood to vote in the presidential election. So they're all said that there's a possible chance that they will vote, but in fact, over 80% of people said that they're absolutely certain that they're going to vote in November. So we've got a very, engaged and ready to go group of people. For this survey specifically, we wanted to focus on women, so we included 600 women voters in the survey, just so that we'd be able to look at different demographic groups and sort of see the differences within the broader women sample. The entire sample was weighed to ensure that it reflected the 2020 audience in general. I think that's kind of it on the boring stuff, so let's jump to the data. Okay. So I'm going to sort of kick things off with some good news. 2016 marked a new era of women's involvement in political issues and campaigns, and shows no signs of stopping in the 2020 cycle. First thing we did was ask voters to think about their political involvement over the last few years and how they would describe it. Are they getting more involved, getting less involved, or is their involvement largely staying the same? And we found that among women overall, 16% said that they were getting less involved. And so that's a teeny tiny number. I think that's sort of where we were very encouraged to see, like, people are not only getting more, they're not just staying involved, they're getting more involved, and very few women were say that they were getting less involved. And sort of to that, 3 in 10 women said that they were getting more involved. So this is again looking back from 2016 over the last few years, what does their involvement look like? And leading the charge, we have a few subgroups up on the screen here. Leading the charge are Democratic women, Millennial women, and women of color. Over a third of each of these voter blocks said that they have gotten more involved in the last few years. And then just a note on Millennial women. A lot of Millennial women have recently come to age where they would get politically involved, but we see this number at 41% sort of reflecting how they see their role in politics. And so again, just not stopping as we look ahead to 2020. And then sort of in that same lane, we asked voters to think about their political involvement over the next year and how would they describe that. More involved, less involved? Do they expect to be more involved, less involved, or stay the same? And we found that only 9% of women said that they expect to be less politically involved in 2020. So again, even fewer women saying that they're going to be less politically involved. And then again, the sort of same groups are really poised to be strong voices throughout 2020, Democratic women, Millennial women, and women of color. Among each of these groups, 40% of Democratic women, Millennial women, and women of color expect to be more involved. So that's, a large chunk of people not just saying that they're not going to be involved, but saying that they're actually going to increase their involvement in the next year. One sort of note to Democratic women versus Republican women, only 23% of Republican women said they expect to be more involved this election compared to the 40% of Democratic women. So, this is a little bit of a cause for concern for the Republican Party. Just, as we saw in 2018, increased activism translates directly to the ballot box, where we saw, over 500 women running for office in Congress and statewide elections, and then also record number turnout. So definitely something to keep an eye on as we look ahead to 2020. So beyond just whether or not they're going to get more involved or less involved, we also looked at specifically what women are doing to participate in politics, and asked, if they have taken each of the following actions in the past few years. So you kind of see the actions on the left-hand side. 42% of women said that they have encouraged friends or family to vote or get involved in a campaign or issue. 33% signed a petition. 24% contacted an elected official, and so on and so forth. Sort of a call out down below on millennial women. Millennial women are definitely, again, sort of leading the charge. We saw increased numbers on most of these actions, but specifically 23% attended a march or rally, and 10% engaged in civil acts of civil disobedience. So we were joking a couple of weeks ago that everyone's very inspired by Jane Fonda. I think that will just continue as we go forward. And sort of one thing to note here, a lot of these actions are specifically community-oriented, and that's definitely a key commitment for women, and definitely a big driver and part of their political engagement. In general, when you look at men versus women, their political participation on many of these actions are generally the same, maybe a point or two off, except for that top one, where we have 42% of women saying that they've encouraged others, and only 35% of men. So that's a clear difference between the two genders, where women are really bringing more people into the fold and developing a broader community. Sort of also in line with different subgroups sort of taking the charge and pushing these things forward are women of color. They are central to sort of this rising tide of activism. On all of these key actions, women of color are definitely participating at higher rates, whether it's donating, organizing, volunteering, marching. Their participation is very key. And now, strong participation among women of color is not to say that this is unique to the last few years. Women of color have historically played a big role in politics across the country and at every level of political engagement. But in the last year, we found that people are finally taking notice and talking about it and providing some very long overdue recognition. So it's not to say that this is a new theme, but definitely it's in the news a lot more. Oh, I also forgot to sort of tee things off. If anyone has questions about the data or the research as I go through, feel free to just raise your hand and we can answer them. Okay, so beyond just measuring women's political engagement and the different actions they're taking, we also wanted to look at and what's motivating them, what's sort of getting the reasons behind why they want to get involved, and also what's holding them back and sort of the barriers they see to involvement. So first, we'll take a look at some of the barriers that women have identified. We tested a variety of reasons one might have to not get involved, and asked voters to read the list and choose up to 5 reasons that sort of apply to them personally, and then choose the top reason for why they have not gotten involved in the past few years. And we found basically across the board, across age, race, and party affiliation, that time is the biggest barrier for women's political participation. For women, this is really about having just a lot of other things going on. So we saw that again across Democratic women, Republican women, independent women, millennials, white women, women of color. It really cuts across all of these key demographic groups.
Okay, can you clarify on this? This number is among women who say that they have not gotten involved.
Right, so that's right. So we, we'll show the barriers and we'll also show reasons why they have gotten involved. And just in terms of asking the question, it was a little easier to sort of identify people that have either not gotten involved or gotten involved. So all of this data is among women who have basically not done 2 or more of these actions. So it's sort of an arbitrary definition of engaged versus not engaged, but these women are sort of generally less engaged than others. A key distinction, so I mentioned that time is a key barrier for women and is very cross-cutting across key demographic groups. A key distinction between women and men is that time is not a giant barrier for men. Yes, money, in fact, is a much bigger barrier. So, when we looked, if you sort of look at the data here, we, again, 22% of women identified, I'm too busy working and or taking care of my family as their top reason for not getting involved. And then among men, only 7% said that, but, only 12%. Another one of the barriers that we looked at was, I don't have the money to make a difference on political issues. Now, as you can see, women, that's sort of a middling barrier. Not a ton of people identified it as a key reason to not get involved, but among men, this was the top reason that they didn't get involved. So, we were sort of talking about what this means, and to me, this data suggests that, women look at what they have to offer, whether it's time, money, relationships, and they don't see the perception of not having enough money to stand in their way and be an obstacle for political engagement. Of less than $50,000 a year or over $150,000 a year. So it really isn't about whether or not you have money, but really the time to dedicate yourself. And then one more barrier to go through, and then we'll get to the more positive things. But the other big distinction between men and women is this confidence in their own political knowledge. On the left-hand side, you'll see news consumption between men and women, and generally speaking, the news that they consume every day is basically even. You'll have across a variety of platforms. 21% of men and women say that they watch broadcast network news once a day or more, 16 and 19 for cable news, and so on. So pretty comparable news consumption. But despite that, women are 3 times more likely than men to choose, I don't know enough about political issues to get involved as their top reason. So this is really pointing to a dynamic that I think we hate to admit, but have seen in a lot of different instances. Recently on the national stage, Amy Klobuchar sort of called out Pete Buttigieg about, would a woman with his experience be on the debate stage right now? So I think it's definitely a conversation that more and more people are having, but it's sort of, starting to see those numbers. So we have to continue to build confidence in women as they get involved. Okay, so now the positive things. Why do women get involved? The top reason for Democratic women, Republican women, and independent women alike are really about their aspirations, about the aspirations they hold for their country, whether it's I want to make my country a better place or I want to make sure our country moves forward, not backward. Those are sort of the two, a lot of the top 4 in this list kind of like touch on the same themes, like what life do they want for themselves, their children, their friends, their family, what does the country need to move forward? So that's really what's driving a lot of women's involvement, again, across party ID and age and things like that. One sort of notable difference is among women of color, I'm afraid of what will happen if people like me don't get involved is the top reason to get involved. So the stakes are a little higher among women of color, and I think we see that reflected in their passion and enthusiasm and energy in a variety of political actions that they're taking. I will say, despite this sort of seemingly cohesive set of reasons, the sort of way that they interpret these reasons and motivators for getting involved differs starkly along partisan lines. In either case, whether on the left or the right, women voters sort of see a change that needs to happen, but on the right side, it's a lot of concern over the liberal agenda, and on the left, it's fear that Trump is halting progress or fueling hate. So really depends on how they're interpreting a lot of these, but again, just sort of, they're fighting for a better future and a better country. Okay. And then finally, at the end of the survey, we asked all voters, would they be more or less likely to volunteer for or donate to a variety of candidates with different qualities. Up here we just have the data for a woman candidate, but you can see that women are inspired by other women's political involvement, whether that's getting involved in organizations or running for office. So, when they see other women on the ballot box, it does make a difference, not just who they vote for, but also inspiring them to get involved. This isn't, the way the question was asked is not who would you vote for, but who are you more likely to volunteer for or donate to. And 43% of women say they're more likely to volunteer or donate to a women candidate. And then again, in sort of these key subgroups that we've been carrying out for this whole thing, over half of Democratic women, Millennial Women, and women of color say they're more likely to be inspired by a female candidate. So that is sort of a quick run through, and then we can talk through some of the themes. You guys have any questions?
I have a quick question.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, so on the political involvement one, when you said that people who've chosen fewer than 2 of those options, did that take into consideration ongoing participation? For example, if someone's really, really involved in going to town halls or something, does that regularly compared to someone who had done, let's say, 3 of those items once each?
Mm-hmm. No, so the way that we, again, very sort of fast and loose defining these groups was, it was a yes or no, like, have you done any of these actions in the last few years? I will say, just looking, asking this question in a variety of different surveys and looking through the data, the majority of people that are consistently engaged in one of these things are regularly engaged in at least more than one, especially because some of this is a sort of culled down list, but we had other things that are donated, put up a bumper sticker, kind of like low bar activities that they would qualify in for.
On the obstacles, you noted that lack of knowledge, lack of confidence in knowledge was one. Did you have apathy as a variable? Just I'm not interested.
So we have probably a few kind of nuanced versions of that. I'm glad you brought that up because I think an encouraging part of this list is that other people are getting involved, so I don't feel like I need to. Is the bottom performing. So I think it's not about a lack of desire, but more about sort of tangible barriers that might be getting in their way.
Was there as much variation by race and party when you're looking at the polling from the men?
Sorry?
Was there as much variation like when you're looking at race and party with the polling from the men who used?
So we only included about 200 men in the survey because we wanted to provide bigger base samples for the women. I will say on party ID, it just sort of falls along similar partisan lines, but we don't really have the base sizes to dig too deep into the male audience. Now I'm ready for a question.
I was just going to ask if you have any data on their past voting patterns or behaviors, like whether they are always voting in presidential and midterms, or if they think of political action in terms of these items less or more so than actually voting.
So I believe we did ask past vote history, so I can sort of like look back through it and have it off the top of my head. I will say just anecdotally, most likely 2020 voters are kind of consistent presidential to presidential. Not everyone in this sample will have voted in the 2018 midterms or the 2014, but kind of to your point about how are they defining engagement, I think women especially use a broad definition of what it means to get involved. I think that's evident by just sort of the numbers here, with 42% saying that they do encourage others to vote and things like that. But flipping ahead. On the motivations, when we, on all of these, we asked a sort of follow-up open-ended question asking them to explain why they chose one of these as their top choice. And almost unanimously, when women said, as an American, I have a duty to get involved, they defined that duty as voting. It was very much tied to duty in voting and the importance of voting and sort of their responsibility to the country to vote. Like, we got a lot of, I don't have a right to complain if I don't vote. So they kind of made that connection very clearly.
Yeah, that would be interesting in the future to sort of suss out the political power that women think is inherent in these different types of actions relative to voting.
Yeah, absolutely. And sort of how does that encourage them to do more, or if it disencourages like certain types of actions? Yeah, absolutely.
So for this question, was this asked of women who said they had done the 3 political actions?
So yes, so this would be the sort of the flip side of the less engaged group. This is among people that have done 2 or more of the actions that we tested earlier. Okay. Oh, yes.
Yeah, we have one question from the live stream.
Oh, great.
What percentage of women who self-identified as not getting involved in politics in 2020 cited organized voter intimidation against minority groups or fear of being subject to physical violence themselves or their families as part of the issue in light of this
I would
era?
have to sort of run the crosstab on that. I know that's sort of an unsatisfying answer, but if you email to me, we can definitely get the answer to that.
Yeah, sure.
I would say in general, the fear motivator was largely in the top 3 or 4 for most subgroups. So I would say it would probably be fairly consistent. But then again, just very much popping among the women of color. And I will also say that this was not a high motivator for men. Okay.
Thank you, Kate.
Thank you.
Thank you for that presentation and the data there. Lexi, can I start with you on this question of Democratic women? Because you wrote this morning in your piece about that, of why that number matters as sort of a warning sign for the Republicans.
Yeah.
What's your thinking on that?
Well, the number, as was mentioned earlier, is that 39%
Yeah.
of Democratic women are say that they're more involved, or they will be more involved now than in 2016, compared to just 23% of Republican women. And I think that's a huge warning sign for the Republican Party, because they've been losing female voters to the Democratic Party at pretty fast rates over the last few cycles. We see that not just in voter trends, but in the trends of which candidates are actually stepping up to run for office at every level. There were a record number of women who were inducted into Congress, but the majority of them are Democrats, and so that leads to a gender disparity in terms of representation of the parties. It also, I think, deters certain women who identify as Republicans from feeling as welcome in the party as Democratic women might, especially when men in leadership in the Republican Party will reject so-called identity politics at any given chance to say like they shouldn't be recruiting women specifically, when Democrats have done that and to their success. And in the midterm elections, you don't have to look too far to the numbers to see that there was a clear pattern in large, significant portions of voters, women, female voters rather, who preferred the Democratic House candidate over the Republican House candidate. Again, maybe that's because of the profile of the women who were running. Maybe it's other things like the issues that they were talking about. Maybe it's President Trump. But there are a lot of warning signs, and the country is changing demographically for sure when we're talking about race and ethnicity, but women are showing their power more and more in elections, and it seems like the Democratic Party is sort of trying to figure out how to capitalize on that and bring more people, women specifically, into the fold, and the Republican Party is sort of stalling on how to do that. There are efforts ongoing for Republicans to get more women into the fold.
I mean, you do see sort of the Women for Trump rallies happening. What are they doing anything else along those lines to try to get more women into the party?
I know that there's a group associated with Senator McSally, which focuses on getting more women into the Republican Party. There's a group of Republican women in Texas who are very focused on the so-called Texodus, which is all these House Republicans who are retiring from Texas, from their Texas seats, and they're really trying to focus on replacing them with women.
Right.
But the interesting thing, I think, when you look at the Trump re-elect campaign and how they're trying to attract female voters, is they talk a lot about the economy. Mm-hmm. And when you talk to the Trump campaign about how they're attracting female voters or people of color, they often rely on, we're spreading a message of the economy and how women and people of color are doing so much better in the Trump economy than they were under President Obama. And that's just sort of like a one-size-doesn't-fit-all message, and the economy might be great, and you might have record low unemployment numbers that you want to tout, which is fine, but that's not going to inspire women or people of color. Like, that's not enough to inspire them to come into the fold and not just vote for the candidates, but feel like a welcome member of the party.
Kate, let me ask you, as I hand you the microphone here too, since we're sharing, in that last slide that you had about women supporting other women, the number of Republican women who said they're more likely to support a women candidate was 30%. How did that strike you? Was that something? It seemed high for me because in some of the other research we've done, we've found Republican women who are, sort of fine with the number of women that are in office right now. One of the polls we did last year was sort of, basically, it's okay that women were at 19% in Congress and among Republican women. It's like, that's fine. So does that 30% number surprise you at all?
So I would say it does and it doesn't. I think I wasn't surprised that the Republican number was much lower, just because we were sort of talking about this a little earlier. Republican women and older women, white women, kind of demographic groups that fit within the Republican Party, really don't want to rock the boat at home. So a lot of women in general, regardless of party ID, kind of vote alongside with their husband and just sort of follow suit within what's happening within the sort of family home. So I think again, they're not looking for sort of an untraditional type of candidate. And I think talking about the poll we had previously done on electability, I think women of all, especially Republican women, but they're sort of questioning like, oh, do I, want to stick my neck out for a female candidate if I don't think she's going to get elected? So I think it's a little bit more of a tense conversation for Republican women, and then also just sort of thinking through how, the question was asked whether it's to donate or volunteer for. We did see just lower engagement among Republican women across the board. So I think with that in mind, it's not surprising that they're much lower. But sort of to your point, it's still a third of Republican women saying like, I will support a woman candidate. And I think to me, sort of arguing both sides, but it's my diplomatic answer. But I think kind of going back to the community point for women and how they really see that as an integral part of their political involvement, I think they are probably inspired by a lot of Republican female candidates that are running or have been in office for a long time. That kind of gives them, it inspires them and sees their political identity and kind of plays that identity politics for them a little bit.
Amanda, you guys at Barber Family Foundation have done a lot on sort of that modeling component that Kate was talking about too, seeing women out there in front. I mean, we were talking earlier today about the New York Times endorsement of the 2 women running it. What impact does that have on other women for engaging in politics and also for running themselves?
So at the Barbara Lee Family Foundation, we've studied every gubernatorial race involving a woman since 1998 on both sides of the aisle. And what we found, and you can just see it if you look into it, in states where there's been a woman governor, it often opens the door for another woman governor. And that's because there's what we like to call an imagination barrier for a lot of voters. And when they see a woman in executive office succeeding in the job, it breaks down those stereotypes in their mind. And that's something that we're looking at in 2020. There's obviously a very gendered expectation of what a presidential candidate looks like, and that's an older white man, because for hundreds of years that's what we had in this country. And there's also a commander-in-chief stereotype. But at a state level, there's still the emergency management component and other issues that folks have to be convinced that a woman will be able to handle. But then once they see one woman, like in Michigan, for example, with Jennifer Granholm, it opened the door for Gretchen Whitmer, who was often compared to Jennifer Granholm, even though the main thing they had in common is that they're both women. So, and one quick note on the Republican piece too. We did research in the end of 2017 and found that women on both sides of the aisle had a lot of advantages with voters. And voters on both sides of the aisle said they were more likely to vote for a woman if they believe that a woman serves differently when she's in office.
Well, I mean, to that point, though, too, on sort of this role of women in executive leadership. We had a panel yesterday with 3 mayors that are in town for the mayor's conference, and so we talked to them about some of those different aspects. And they, the mayor of Dayton, Nan Whaley, mention the Barbara Lee Foundation specifically in terms of being the research that you all are doing, being very helpful to her as she was trying to navigate running as mayor of that city. And what do you all tell female candidates that are running for executive offices, governor or mayor, on and how to sort of navigate all of these different components?
Well, the main piece of advice are really just kind of realistic fact that women need to know, especially when seeking executive office, is that they are expected to be twice as good. And that's because men are assumed to be qualified and women have to prove they're qualified over and over. That's why if you watch the presidential debates, it's probably no accident that Senators Warren and Klobuchar are often using action verbs and saying, I passed legislation, I made this happen, because they have to constantly remind voters that they're getting results, whereas men just have to release their resume. So that's the first piece. The other side of it that we've talked about before here, I know, is the likability tightrope, that voters will not vote for a woman if they don't like her, but they will vote for a man that they do not like if they believe that he's qualified. So it's a fine line. Women have to, especially with executive office, satisfy two gender stereotypes. They have to show that they're strong enough, but they can't be too tough because they won't be likable. And presentation is so important. And I think that that's what Mayor Whaley was talking about yesterday, that women, the standard is really perfection, because voters look at how a woman is dressed, they assess the sound of her voice, and they assess her confidence. They assess a woman's confidence in less than 30 seconds, and if they don't think she's confident, they're not going to like her. And also, women have to be very prepared. If a woman makes a mistake on the campaign trail, or if her campaign makes a mistake, she pays a much higher price because voters assume that she's not qualified and learning on the job. So that's why we see a lot of times, and we thought about this with the confidence differential in this study, that women are often almost overqualified when they run for office because they have to be that much more qualified to convince voters that they can do the job.
Yeah, Alexi, how have you, as you're covering this campaign though, how have you seen some of those issues play out among the female candidates in 2020 here?
Well, the big question that we were all asking ourselves in the media at the start of this cycle, obviously after 2016, was will those mutters of, oh, there's something I just don't like about her, that we heard from so many people about Hillary Clinton in 2016, continue and apply to the several women who are running in the Democratic primary this year. Obviously, there are only 2 left now. But that was the big thing we were all kind of looking out for, because then that would raise the question about sexism in the country and how sexist are voters actually, if suddenly there are 5 women to pick from and there's something you just don't like about all of them, but you can't put your finger on it. That didn't totally happen, right? Warren has been in the front-runner seat, or one of them, for a while now. Klobuchar just got the New York Times editorial board endorsement. But you do hear from voters, I will say I hear a lot from voters who are excited about voting for a woman, and older women especially, who say things like, I just really want to have a female president once in my lifetime. The flip side, of course, is like I've had conversations with many men who are like, I love Elizabeth Warren, but like none of my friends are going to vote for her. Or I really like Amy Klobuchar, but they'll say things like they like her because she's like pragmatic and serious. You know, so it's almost like she has
They like her, but they might not necessarily vote for her because they don't think she can win.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And the conversation about electability is important because it has to really explore whether or not it's influenced by likability. And when people say things like, oh, well, I think Biden's the most electable because he has the best chance of beating Trump, how are they getting there? How are you defining what it actually takes to beat Donald Trump? And I've talked to voters about that, of course, and they talk a lot about someone who is more moderate, who can appeal to, you know, disaffected Republican voters who went to Trump in 2016 but aren't totally happy with him. But that obviously takes a certain type of personality that might be easier for a man to exhibit if you're standing on the stage against someone like Donald Trump, who, you know, says what he said about women, and just, you know, the physical difference between he's kind of tall and, you know, the women are not as tall as him. So it's interesting to think about because we have had this historic primary in which more women have run in a Democratic primary than ever before, but it still just kind of feels like the country isn't totally ready for that.
Right. And Kate, let me ask you from a polling perspective. I mean, my opinion of this is that, you know, in this election, voters are very highly motivated by, Democratic voters are highly motivated by the general election in terms of defeating Trump. It seems to be much more so than other elections. That seems to be a high motivating factor on who they're going to support. And so essentially we've turned voters into political pundits, right? And they're having to ask themselves, is this person going to be able to win? What are your thoughts on that and sort of the change of how we are actually looking at Democratic women in particular looking at candidates?
So, I think it's very hard for voters to kind of go with decide who they're going to vote for in the Democratic primary where I think, there's so many different candidates and you can really think about which candidate reflects your values and which candidate you want, but then it's sort of at tension with who's going to be able to take on Donald Trump in a general election debate, and they know how unpredictable that's going to be. And so I think, sort of my view, and especially from, where we see different candidates, especially the two female candidates get the biggest bump in some of the polling that we see is always after, a debate of some kind, because I think, Amanda, to your point about having to constantly prove yourself and show, I can compete with Trump on the debate stage and things like that, you see Senators Warren and Klobuchar really excelling on the debate stage, and I think those are some of their strongest moments when they can really prove their achievements and talk about their story and really make the case for themselves. And so you see that very much reflected in the polling where, again, you just have Biden is sort of the big guy that I think everyone's kind of like falling back on. Like, he can take on Trump. He's made that case over and over. And you don't really see a lot of swing between his performance in the polling, at least.
Betsy?
Yeah.
I have a question, if you have any data or any anecdotes about a comment made by the mayors last night, which is that sometimes it's a disadvantage to have a larger female field. Nan Whaley said that about her race in Dayton. She was looking at the governor's race.
Because the women's vote being split amongst too many
have you all seen that play out? Or, are you seeing anything in that, in the current, like when the field had 6 women in it here?
Well, I think for us, we always are quick to caution that women don't always necessarily vote for other women too, so they can't take that for granted, that women aren't usually monolithic when they vote. But also what is interesting is when you have multiple women in a race, it takes out the tokenization factor and allows voters to look at them for their agenda and other attributes and not just the fact that they're a woman. And we've also found in our research and experience that voters really don't like glass ceiling language. So if people are messaging around like, oh, if we could just get the city council to be majority women, that would break a record. Voters want to know what you're going to do for them, and they don't care if it's going to be something that will be an accolade for you. So we found that is actually annoying to voters when we use that kind of messaging.
I want to go to audience questions in just a minute, but I want to ask you also, Amanda, while you have the mic there. When you run an institute about women in politics and your mission is to close that gender gap in politics, you're always thinking about, how do we get more women to run for office? And I think one of the encouraging things in this poll is sort of that gateway component of, the more women are involved in politics, participating in politics, working for a candidate, volunteer, talking to their friends. Is that a gateway then to have them actually run for office themselves? What have you all found about that in your research?
Yeah, we've definitely seen that play out in the 2018 cycle. In particular, there were so many candidates who were successful because they were activated into politics when they saw the impact of an issue. Right. And our research shows that, voters like when women run because they see the impact of an issue. We're thinking about Lucy McBath and Lauren Underwood, who I know has a connection here, and Katie Porter, 3 examples from the current Congress who maybe were not groomed for a life in politics like a lot of men were, but were activated by something that affected their lives or their community. Voters really like that authenticity, and that seems to be what we're seeing now with women's activation. Maybe they start out marching and volunteering, and then before they know it, they're running for office.
Yeah, I was just say, sort of connecting something back to the data point, that 42% of women that said that they have encouraged other family and friends to vote or get involved. In a recent article in the New York Times that sort of dug into different other women at lower levels that have run for office. And one of the questions that they asked was, why did you do it? And almost every single woman started their response saying, friends and family or people around me told me I should, or something happened and I was encouraged to do it. So it's definitely this sort of community aspect of people are either getting involved and seeing the impact they can have, or getting encouraged by others that are doing the same.
Great. So we have some time for questions out here. So if anyone has any other particular questions about some of the themes we've raised, other data in the poll, please raise your hand and feel free to ask a question. Anyone? Yes, China.
Hi. Thank you all for coming out today. I just wanted to ask, was there a difference in the research between women coming out for local elections versus national elections?
So we didn't actually really dig into local versus national too much. We were really focused on the 2020 cycle, particularly the presidential election. But I think, because this sort of community thread is pretty evident across many data points, I think, it really could be local or national. I think you can kind of extrapolate to either end of it. It's just really like where your community is. Are you getting involved in local politics as a group, or are you, marching in the streets against the White House? So I think, it's that community feel wherever you see it.
But that's a good question too, in terms of, what are the issues that are motivating women? Is it something that's very localized, or is it more national? So maybe an idea for our next poll. Thank you, China. Yeah, Sophie?
Well, given what's happening on the Hill, even as we gather, I wonder if anyone at the table has any thoughts on what the, I guess you would say, anticipated outcome of this trial, what effect that might have on the female electorate. Either
Question.
What you
Pass the microphone.
Yes.
Well, I think that some of the most interesting voters to focus on that I have not focused on enough are the Trump 2016, Gretchen Whitmer 2018 voters, or similar in other battleground states like Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, folks who switched to a Democratic candidate or supporting a Democratic candidate in the midterms after supporting Trump, and especially if that candidate were a Democratic woman. I think it's too early to know exactly how impeachment is going to play out on the trail, but we were talking about this before the panel got started, that anytime I'm traveling, you never hear it from voters. You can't be at an event without hearing someone raise their hand and ask these deeply personal questions about healthcare and how they're one accident away from going bankrupt, or talking about stitching together 2 or 3 jobs to pay for childcare and their 2 children. Rarely, if ever, have I heard a voter raise their hand and say anything about impeachment. And I think that that's because, while we are so focused on this in Washington, and it matters, of course, for the future of the country and the precedent that this could set for the office of the presidency, people are really concerned about their personal financial situation, which gets into everything from healthcare to education. And I think women especially care about healthcare and education even at higher rates than other voters. So, maybe the college-educated white women who supported Trump in significant numbers in 2016 are feeling a little disaffected by him for other reasons, and that led to them voting for Democrats in 2018. And maybe the narrative that will be painted about him because of the impeachment trial will lead to them being further disaffected and throwing their hands up and giving a try to a Democratic candidate. But I think it's just too early to tell.
Yeah, I think it's very evident when any of the senators running for president, when they were asked is this going to affect Iowa in any way, and they were very clear to say, I have a duty, this is important, it's my responsibility, and then quickly pivot to, but I'm very excited to get back on the campaign trail and talk to voters and understand what really matters to them. So I think it's sort of a push and pull between doing your responsibility as a senator and really making sure that the Constitution hasn't been offended in any way, and that Donald Trump is sort of held accountable, but also kind of pivoting back to the voters in the ways that makes the most sense to them.
Yes, sir.
Yes, I'm sort of on the same theme. In the data, is there what percentage were Democratic voters and what percentage were Republican voters? And were you able to note whether there's been any shift from one view to another view during the course of the 2 years, let's say 2016 to 2018 or up till now?
So for this poll, we sort of just weighed the party ID to what we've seen in kind of nationwide polling across the board. I don't actually have the numbers off the top of my head, but I think it's around like 35 Democrat, 35 Independent, and 30 Republican. I will say, sort of as we've kind of tracked, maybe not back from 2016, but around there, the number of independents has slowly creeped up from 33 to now 35, and I think this survey itself was conducted online, and that's sort of where we see a lot more people identify as Democrat or Republican because they're not talking to a person on the phone. But especially when we have phone polling, you see the Republican numbers dip way low. So you do sort of see this trend of people not really wanting to self-identify with the Republican Party unless they are kind of staunch Trump supporters.
Hi. I was just wondering, we were talking earlier a little bit about how we have to tell female candidates that they have to be likable or they have to meet a certain standard of perfection. Based on all of your experiences, do you think the two female candidates at the presidential level, if they are the nominee, do you think they're going to have to meet any unique standards or qualifications going up against Trump?
Well, I think partially because we've never had a successful, won the popular vote, but not a successful female presidential candidate. So there is that imagination barrier, and the fact that any woman has to prove that she's strong enough. So that means getting over the fact that there's never been a woman commander-in-chief of the military. I think even if a woman had a lot of military experience, there still would be a barrier in voters' minds about that issue. So any woman, both of the women that are currently in the race are arguably very qualified, but any woman in that position is going to have to satisfy both the male and female stereotypes and have to really make sure that not only is she twice as good, but her campaign is twice as good. So we talk a lot about how Elizabeth Warren gets a lot of attention for her selfie lines, and it's a really great way to connect with voters. And I'm a nerd about logistics, so the New York Times did a really cool, like, animated thing about how she does it, which I recommend if you haven't seen. But if, God forbid, there were a problem with that selfie line, you can bet that that would be the headline for the Warren campaign for days, and they would have to spend days defending themselves against that instead of talking about policy, because that's what happens when women run, especially at a high level. They pay a higher price for any mistake, whether it's their fault or not. And certainly how a candidate runs their campaign is an important way to judge what kind of a politician they would be in a role, but men are able to kind of laugh off a lot of gaffes and mistakes a lot easier. So any woman is going to be held to much higher standards, not just for herself, but on how her campaign is run, if there's an issue with her campaign staff, any kind of logistical issues, all of those things.
And to your likability point, I think, and might just be my optimism talking, but I think Senators Warren and Klobuchar do a really good job of just being authentic, especially in all of the debates. And I hope that whoever the candidate ends up, if it's either of them, that will sort of be a strong point for them in their debates against Donald Trump, because they have very much shown their personality and through it a lot of their strengths.
Yeah, and I will add one more thing on that note, that both senators have very effectively used humor, which can be an effective tool for women. We have a great blog about it on Gender on the Ballot, if you want to read it. But women have to be careful in the way that they use humor. If you see, like, Hillary Clinton on Saturday Night Live, she was never the jokey one in the sketch. Women are usually still playing the politician in the sketch and being serious, and someone else is making the jokes. They can't be too goofy. So they even have to be deliberate in how they're using humor, but we do think that both senators have been very effective in the way that they've made some witty barbs and jokes on the debate stage.
Yeah.
I was wondering if anyone has had experience either with numbers or narratively on how effective the message of pushing back on these stereotypes or double standards is. Is it effective to reach people by saying, don't judge this male or female candidate using double standards, or is it better to focus on the positives that a woman can bring?
Well, so I think, again, kind of pointing to the last debate, I think, again, my own personal opinion, the best way to do that is just with facts and your accomplishments. And so when Senator Warren sort of pivoted to the stage and said, I think I'm electable because the only people on this stage that have won every race are the women. That kind of implicitly sort of says, like, don't have this double standard, but explicitly says, I've won all of my races, so I'm clearly electable. So I think it's, sort of leading with a fact and then just sort of not focusing on the double standard, but sort of neutralizing it in that way.
Yeah, and we haven't looked at that where we'd like to look at it. It's very complex to study, but we do know from our focus groups that voters don't like anything that can be perceived as whining or blaming. So if women are going to confront anything, they have to be careful not to paint themselves as a victim or be blaming somebody else.
Yes, ma'am.
So, I'm from Europe, from Hungary, and it's very interesting to me to see it here. In Hungary, I was the Deputy Secretary of State responsible for gender equality, and that's why it's very interesting to hear your views on women's political participation. And I'm just listening to the results and the composition of voters and so on, and my impression is, I'm just speaking about my first impression, is that we've been speaking about, all of these things that you're mentioning, that women have to be more sensitive, how they should look like, and so on and so on. So just my impression is that it is not changing, or this was the issue 15 years ago, and even today we speak about the same things. I feel it a shame, because on one hand it's a responsibility of the whole society, how we teach ourselves, how we try to make women more sensitive, or just to know more about politics and about our role in the society. Another impression is that for me, that it seems that the American society is a bit more conservative than the European countries.
Or what?
More conservative.
Okay, yeah.
So because in Europe we don't speak about too much, or at least if you look at Germany, for example, there is Chancellor Merkel. Yeah, at the beginning many people talked about her hairstyle and so on, and so the lookout and so on, what she wears. But today what I can see is that more and more women get elected in the European Union. There are leaders, prime ministers. So actually, we don't speak so much about the appearance and the personal qualities and the knowledge and the professionalism is much more important, I think, and what they can offer for women. So I remember when I was here 2 years ago, many young women were very enthusiastic about Hillary Clinton, and they expected so much, just like people expected so much from Obama when he was elected. But what he did for the African American people, or what these people can do for their own groups, let's say. So it's not always clear. So actually, I don't feel in these campaigns when I listen to female Democratic candidates, what they can offer to women, how they try to translate their experiences, how they want to change the American society in favor of women. This is missing for me from the debates. Maybe I miss the points, but what you don't speak about it, or that's what we emphasize more in the European Union. This is my opinion. What kind of society we imagine for women? That's, I think, really important.
And I think some of those issues too, on our Gender on the Ballot blog, we do a tracking of all the debate questions that are asked, and the issues about women and issues that women care about have not been raised as much in the debates. There was a couple of exceptions. The debate that coincidentally was moderated by 4 women, right? But we're keeping track of all that data so that we know, what are those questions posed and why. But it's.
Well, I do think it's interesting compared to 2016, of course, just because it was only Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders. I think and it was such a historic moment for the country to see a woman coming so close to capturing the presidency, that was just like part of her shtick in a way that it just hasn't really come up in this primary cycle. I think it's because there are more women running, because the contrast doesn't have to be so explicitly dependent upon their gender. They can talk about many different things, but I think the one interesting difference between 2016 and 2020 is that you hear a lot more about Black women and issues that affect Black women. You hear that from the male candidates and the female candidates talking in a really intersectional way about their healthcare plans or environmental plans or economic plans and have specific carve-outs for what that means for Black women and what that would mean for, you know, the future of the country for Black women and their lives in the future. And so that's been an interesting shift, because in 2016 that wasn't really a conversation that the country was having, you know, let alone Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton. It's at least at the length that we're having now.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, I have a question about women on the ballot. Do you think it is such a hard pill to swallow because of the fact that we just had a Black president? I mean, a lot of people in my circles talked about, you know, when Hillary Clinton ran, she probably should have stepped back and allowed a white man to run, because we just had a Black male as president for 2 terms. Maybe there was some fatigue, you know, like the white man have his say so, and then, you know, then I mean, so do you think that that has any play on it? Because, you know, several years ago we were talking about the same thing, that when Blacks are Black and they'll be president, you know, and so I'm thinking the minority syndrome.
Right.
Is that a syndrome that, you know, hold on
Well,
for
we
a
do
minute.
know historically that elections are usually flip-flop from one side to the other in terms of people supporting someone who maybe the opposite of what you had in terms of president. Almost an overcorrection. Yeah.
Well, and we like to point out that in the 2018 midterms, a lot of the most exciting candidates that were successful were women of color, and the candidates that energized voters, that motivated them to get involved and go to the polls, and upset candidates like Ayanna Pressley in my hometown of Massachusetts, were, you know, the narrative was she's going to lose, she doesn't have a chance, and she put her head down, she organized, she had a great campaign, and it was a huge upset. So I think that we like to remind people that there were a lot of races like that in 2018 where there were plenty of naysayers, and it turned out that those naysayers were not in touch with actual voters in the community. And we hope that we see that trend continue with women, because it does seem like from our research and just what we've seen anecdotally, women have been able to connect with voters and motivate them in a different way.
And that's kind of been an interesting departure from expectations at the start of this cycle, because of the 2018 midterms and the profile of candidates who were really exciting and who did win their elections, which were mostly women of color. As you mentioned, I think a lot of people thought because of that and for other reasons, Senator Kamala Harris would have been the nominee, like hands down. Everyone was very excited about that. She had a wonderful launch. She got a lot of people out and a lot of attention. She raised a lot of money. Someone like Julian Castro was talking about all these intersectional issues that, you know, if you have been following Democratic Party politics in the last few years, you'd think that they like really prioritize that. Democratic primary voters really prioritize those issues that were being talked about by people like Julian Castro, Kamala Harris, Beto O'Rourke, and all of them are now out of the presidential race. So it's interesting to think about, to your point, Kate, earlier about how people go maybe from one extreme to the other. We have someone like Donald Trump now. There are all these women of color who were supported and successful in 2018, and now it's almost as if the country is showing that they are more open, or at least Democratic primary voters are more open to a more moderate candidate, whether that's someone like Pete Buttigieg or Joe Biden, or they're more interested in familiar faces like Bernie Sanders. Of course, Elizabeth Warren is the only woman at the top, but they're all white, and 3 of the 4 are men. So it's the complete opposite of the trends that we've been watching, or at least I've been watching in Democratic Party politics, than we would have expected at the start of the cycle. And I think that's something that I still can't wrap my brain around.
Yeah,
well,
but I hear you what you're saying, but you know, back then I heard a lot of folks say if Hillary Clinton was a man, she would have won. You know, I've heard that. You know, if Hillary Clinton was a man, she would have won. And I work in an environment with a lot of males, and they tell me I would have voted for her if she was a man. You know, he just had a black president. You know, I was looking forward to voting for a white male. I mean, race is an issue, you know, and, you know, just like gender is. So, you know, you hear that, you know, from people.
Well, to go back to your Obama example, I think if you look back in 2008 and look at the beginning of the primary for Iowa and Hillary Clinton being at the top of the polls there, and it wasn't, if you look at polls among people of color in South Carolina, in terms of support for Barack Obama, you did not see that support among African Americans in South Carolina for Obama until he won in Lily White, Iowa, right? And then you saw the support skyrocket among African Americans in South Carolina for Obama, and ultimately won the primary there. So there might be a snowball effect that goes on in terms of if a woman can launch out of there, then maybe there's more support to be had. So.
Yeah, and along those lines, and I think President Obama, they didn't call it this at the time, but it's what it was. We found in 2018 a lot of women have to run what we call a campaign of belief. In addition to their main stage campaign trying to win over voters, they have to win over donors and thought leaders and party leaders and other elites and convince them that they can win. So that's a burden that we're seeing women carry right now in the 2020 cycle that the men don't have to carry to the same extent.
Do we have time for one more question? Yeah, way in the back here. Yes, go ahead, Black. Yeah.
Okay. I'm wondering if in your research or reporting, if you've seen if geography is a factor at all, since there's been so much political targeting towards suburban women, especially done by Trump's re-election campaign. Like if that changes how much women are even able to politically participate.
So, you know, I would say that it often does kind of follow along political party affiliation. Urban centers are obviously more liberal, rural and suburban are a little bit more moderate and conservative. But again, it really kind of centers around different types of activities. So, you know, you may have a very strong organizational setup in some of the sort of suburban networks where you do see a lot more female engagement because that's part of their community and it's part of you know, their day-to-day, and they have other women and other people in their lives that are engaging and being a part of the political conversation. And then you kind of see it sort of trail off as you become more rural. So I would say it's not just sort of a chicken for the egg. The urban centers are more liberal, and there's definitely a lot more energy and excitement within the Democratic Party right now in terms of engagement. But I would also say it's because there's also just a lot more density of people and a lot more opportunities and ways to get involved.
Well, I want to thank you all for coming today and let you know that our Gender on the Ballot website has all of the slides and the key takeaways memo and all the information on that website and a lot of other research that we've done. So I encourage you to check that out. And thank you so much to our panel today. We appreciate you being here.